Welcome to everyone. Apologize for the little bit of a challenge there. We're all excited to be here, and Zoom was questioning for a little bit and is now on board. Welcome to this third in a series of webinars by PyroLife for its Symposium towards an integrated fire management. We have over 300 registered for this webinar, and want to welcome and give a good afternoon to many from Europe and the UK who have signed on. Good morning to a growing audience from the United States and North America, which we're happy to see. And for some who are coming in from Australia, a happy tomorrow. My name is Lucian Deaton. I work with the National Fire Protection Association with our wildland fire community engagement and international outreach. I want to share with you quickly this morning some of the technical aspects of this webinar, and then we'll hear from our speakers. The speakers will have 30 minutes. There'll be about 15 minutes after that for questions, as we've done. The audio and video, or the ability to speak, has been turned off for participants in the webinar. So we encourage you, when you want to ask a question, to scroll over the screen. You'll have pop up at the bottom the Q&A box. And please put a question in there. That will then come to us, and we'll be able to curate it when we come to the question and answer period. Please don't use the chat function if that's available, because we want all the questions in one space so we can see what they are and get to all of them as we can. When you write in the question, if it is easier for you to write in your own language, in your mother tongue, that's just fine. We have the ability to translate it on this end. The questions will be answered spoken in English, but if it's easier for you to pose them in your own language, we're happy for that and encourage it. Also, diversity is obviously very important to PyroLife, both in the research and the folks involved. So we encourage young researchers, women, others to provide questions in. Don't hold back. We want to receive all of them. This is being recorded. It will be on the YouTube channel for PyroLife. You've also seen on the Symposium page underneath speakers, broken up into their segments, or on the website. And on Twitter, the hashtag PyroLife Symposium is a great place to share thoughts about today's webinar, previous ones, and the entire symposium series. I want to introduce our speakers this morning. Peter Moore, who will be speaking first, is actually a part of the partner organizations with the PyroLife effort. He will be hosting some of the PhD students that are part of the program, and we thank all the partner organizations who are doing that. There are over 15. If you go on the PyroLife website under the About section, you can see who they are and the real great breadth of diversity across industries that they bring to this effort. Peter Moore is the Forestry Officer for Fire Management with the UNFAO. He has over 35 years of operational management and policy experience, pulling from more than 30 countries of work, including his own in Australia. He'll be speaking today about how to live with fire, where in the world, and what does that suggest. And that'll be over a 30-minute period. We also have Foucault Ludwig, who is the Professor for Water Systems and Global Change Group with Wageningen University. He was to speak today about living with fire. What can we learn from the experience in the water sector? Unfortunately, he had a family emergency earlier today and is understandably not able to join us. But his webinar will become a part of a future one, and we certainly wish him well today, but we will hear from him soon. So to move forward with the presentations, Peter Moore, we look forward to hearing from you. And I think after that and the questions, we may also speak to a recent paper that Peter and some others wrote on COVID-19 to fill in some of the rest of the webinar for everyone who joined us this morning. So Peter, I look forward to hearing from you today, and thanks for presenting.
Thank you very much, Lucian. Firstly, I wish Foucault and his family all the best with their emergency. I'm very sorry that I won't be here. Won't be hearing from him just yet, but we will in the future. It was a fascinating thought to me that the Netherlands is so proficient at managing water, and that there are lessons from that undoubtedly those of us who work or attempt to manage fire could take on. I'm also very, very happy to be talking to PyroLife. As Lucian mentioned, the FAO is one of the partners. One of the students will come to FAO to look at forest governance and governance of natural resources. And we're very much looking forward to hosting them. And I'm very enthusiastic about this concept. Lucian mentioned I have 35 years of experience. He was being polite. I've got a bit more than that now. And throughout that experience, one of the issues has been that the representation of people, the representation of sectors, the representation of disciplines has been relatively narrow. And so the idea of having 15 PhD students who are going to work together, study together across disciplines and interact is just a fantastic idea. And congratulations to Catalina and the others who've brought that together. This morning, I was talking to a group of Indonesian forestry and palm oil companies about COVID-19, and it identified to me that one of the things you should remember as we all go through life generally, but fires in particular, is don't ever lock any doors and don't shut anything. I started working in Indonesia in 1999. I worked there for 4 years. With all due respect to the project we were on and everything else, I don't think we achieved anything meaningful in the long term. But now we've got the companies actually seeking out input from others. So things change. So just remember to persist. This presentation today is a reflection on some global figures, some numbers, an introduction for some of you at least to the FAO world of fire where I work, somewhat different to where we are today, and then some thoughts, and then at the very end a random thought that occurred to me a week ago or so, and I think it's probably worth putting out there. So in 2019, that's last year, the world was all on fire. If you remember, the Arctic Circle, including Greenland, was on fire in June and into July, and then the Amazon region caught fire, and there was a lot of press and other interaction around that. Then Indonesia caught fire, and then about August, Australia had been burning and it really picked up on what it was doing. And so the whole world was talking about fire until COVID-19. And this is something that we really need to note very carefully. Fire is very much an ephemeral, intermittent sort of an activity. Even the really big ones, and even say a very long season like the one that Australia suffered over its last southern summer. As soon as something else comes into the mix, then fires are off the front page. They're out of the political frame and they're off the point of interest. And it's something we need to recall and keep note of. That's part of the reason that working with PyroLife to cross disciplines, cross sectors, and cross governments and agencies is a really important thing. In 2000, WWF and IUCN released a review of forest fires, a global review. You might remember that 97, 98, Indonesia was in trouble. A lot of Russia burned in 99. Australia had a bad fire season in 98. California, yet again, was burning at about the same time. So there was it seemed that the world was on fire, so they produced this review. And since then, there have been a series of other reports. There's been a lot of research. There's been reviews, and of course, there's been any number, an uncountable number of no-profile fires. Almost without exception, the high-profile fires are in the developed world. If you sit for a minute and you think about, say, the top 3 fire events you can recall from the past 10 years, say, I would be very surprised if any of them were not in the developed world, whether you recalled Greece and the dreadful fire there in 2018, the fires in Sweden in 2018, fires in Portugal 2017, California, and so on. The developing world sees very few high-profile fires, apart from Southeast Asia, which is mainly Indonesia, and occasionally, as I mentioned, for 2019, the Amazon region. Now, why is that the case? Globally, this is the annual burned area and the annual average burned area for between 2001 and 2018. Every 5 years, the FAO produces a document called the Forest Resources Assessment, where it collaborates with the countries and seeks to present a summary document of forests by different categorisations. And this year they included burned area. The annual average is around about 400,000 hectares of fire per year. As you can see, interestingly enough, since 2012, we've been below the average. Where do those fires take place? And here's a graphic that illustrates that. Don't worry about the two little blocks in the bottom right-hand corner. We'll get to those in a minute and you'll know where they are. But if you have a look in rough figures, it's obviously more than half of the world's burned area is in Eastern and Southern Africa and Western and Central Africa. Now, those that you've worked there or been there or visited probably are not terribly surprised at that. And then if you add in Northern Africa, then it is certainly 2/3 of the world's burned area in that continent. Oceania comes third, but the reason for that is that Australia is included in Oceania. If you were to take Australia out of Oceania, then it would not contribute very much. We're talking there about the Pacific Island countries and places like Papua New Guinea and like that. South America, as you can see, more than half a million. Europe, over 250,000. Western and Central Asia, 180,000 million, 180 million hectares. And then there's North America, one of the countries, one of the continents that we hear the most about. And there's about 100 million hectares, 120, say, million hectares burned. Okay, what are the implications of that? As I've mentioned, more than 2/3 of the wildfires in the period of nearly 20 years took place in Africa. And yet we didn't hear very much about them. If you look at the subregions of Eastern, Southern, Western, Central Africa, Oceania, Northern Africa and South America, each exceeded half a billion hectares in that period of time. And there's those regions of Western and Central Africa, Eastern and Southern Africa, average more than 100 million hectares per annum. Average. Europe and North America, in a global sense, don't really make the A team. They don't get up there. Here's another look at that same graphic, but now you can see the total burnt area and the tree-covered burnt area. I mentioned this was a forest resources assessment, and so we're interested in two things in terms of fires. One is how much area is burned, and the other is how much of that is tree-covered. And as you can see, Eastern and Southern Africa still at the top of the list. And then the two small squares that were hard to make out are obviously Central America and the Caribbean. But again, if you have a look, North America is quite small, even proportionally, and even compared to the other parts of the world. Notice, though, that Europe, because Russia gets included, manages to pop up. Okay, what are the implications of that sort of set of numbers? Well, firstly, fairly evidently, burnt area does not always reflect damage and loss. Those regions that accrue most of the burned area are generally made up of very large countries with extensive areas of less developed savanna and grassland, much of which burns cyclically and where fire is an ecological influence. All of us, I think, have heard many more times than once that Africa is the fire continent. There are also, of course, relatively speaking, much lower densities of population in those same areas and much less in the way of infrastructure. And so the damage and loss that occurs, when it does occur, does not attract a huge amount of attention. And Europe, with Russia, has a similar burned area to South and Southeast Asia, but South and Southeast Asia is from the western border of Pakistan to the Philippines. So it's a massive part of the world, and Europe and Russia, between them, managed to get about that same area. North America, again, highly visible in the media and in the coverage, but doesn't win the area burnt race. There are also spatial and temporal patterns globally over that same period of time. The tropical domain, so that's from the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer in between the two, exhibited a negative trend in total burned area. And the African region also exhibited a negative trend in total burned area. This is actually global. The burned area around the world is reducing over time. It's not dramatic, but it's a genuine negative trend. Also notably, anthropogenic human impacts are critical factors in determining global fire patterns. And they do that because they increase or decrease wildfire activity through grazing with animals and so on, clearing forests, land use change. So land use change is the dominant factor in places like the Amazon region and in Indonesia. Clearing forests per se, altering ignition patterns, either having more fire or less fire, and of course suppressing fires. So it's a bit confusing. It's not very clear. The area burnt decreasing, yet the reporting of fires is increasing. The profile of them is increasing. How do we rationalise these things a bit? Well, the short answer, and I'm sorry to say this, is that we can't. We certainly can to an extent in developed countries, but even there, it's worth noting that the data sets are not good. FAO did a thematic study of fire incidents some years ago, and the fire affected annually, there were 229 countries. That's more countries than there are in the world, but that's because there are some independent and sovereign states. There's 4 or 5 of those in Italy, for example, that have a certain amount of autonomy. The Vatican, highly unlikely to have had any fires, I suspect, apart from when the Pope needs to be elected. And there are territories of which, of those 229, 83 had no data at all. And 54 of 229 supplied recent data. What that suggested is that 92 countries or territories provided old data or averages. In other words, something that would be very, very difficult to extract any meaningful correlation or interpretation from. So overall, 175 of 229 reports of fire data had weak or no data on fire incidents or land area burned. Now, this same study noted a very critical requirement, and this relates completely to PyroLife and to probably to all of us listening to this to these seminars over the next month or so, is that there's a critical requirement to enhance the transfer of skills, transfer of knowledge, the transfer of ideas, the transfer of know-how and of technology from developed to developing countries. And I'll show you a bit of that in a minute, but I can certainly attest that's a critical need. And we need to do that in much better and much more effective ways. A major thing as well that was noted in this study was that there was research needed to understand how fire was used and why fire was used. If you look at a lot of the numbers that you might see in media reports or websites you can go to, they tell you how many satellite activity data spots there are, sometimes called hotspots. They'll tell you occasionally after a year or so when they've managed to map everything together what the area burnt is, but neither of those pieces of information tell us anything about who did it, how they did it, or why they did it. And that's critical to understand the fire situation globally. So a conclusion, a preliminary one, is to better understand the trends in wildland and forest fires, we need consistent and reliable time series data and forest burned data. Now, I come from Australia, and a friend of mine and I spent about a decade when we were working in fire management in Australia, trying to convince the states to agree to a systematic basic core set of data reporting for fires. We were unsuccessful. So this is not just a developing country capacity issue. There's more to it than that. I mentioned the satellites earlier, and it's very, very useful to note and very valuable that the available systems for monitoring burnt area can be a starting point for more intensive analysis. That could lead to the appropriate intersection of other data sets, such as forest cover, such as demographics, such as linear infrastructure and so on, and their validation at the country level. What the remote sensing allows us to do is put a series of things together and then sit around that map with the stakeholders and have them discuss and tell us what it is they see and what they interpret from that. So if you think about those things, what's the global trend in fires? Where are the fires happening? There's a proportion in forests, but there's many more in open and savanna areas. What's the situation with developed and developing? Are they at different points, or are they on the same curve, but at different parts of the same curve? Just before I go any further, I should say to you that all of these photographs are ones that I took myself, and I have the permission from the people in the photographs to use them, in case you're wondering. So this is a series of photographs from Zimbabwe, Western Zimbabwe and Western Tanzania, that I'll just run through. This is a local community forest group that were explaining what they do about fire management and how they do it. These young men were in Western Tanzania. I didn't ask them to pose or anything. They just came up and sat there looking for ages. They followed me around for a couple of hours. Absolutely gorgeous, and they need some better options if we can give them. This was also in Western Tanzania. These people are clearing away some things to get ready to do this. And this was something that they did. It took about less than an hour to organise, and then they lit everything up. And then about 10 or 15 minutes later, that's what it looked like. Just to give you some context, this young lady's carrying about 30 litres of water, which is 30 kilograms. So it's certainly a skill I don't have. This is the sort of situation these people are living in Western Tanzania. She's just climbed up from about 10 metres below ground level in a very deeply incised creek where there's some pools of water to collect water and bring it up to the surface. The gentleman in the middle there is a gentleman named Dr. Christopher William. He works at the University of Dar es Salaam. He's actually a social and community expert, and he's talking to these people about what they do, about their lives, about their fires, and so on and so forth. So that's a quick run through two places that I've been, Western Zimbabwe and Western Tanzania, and just notice a few things. There's no equipment, none at all, not a single thing. Zip. There's a very rude word we use in Australia to exaggerate nothing, but I won't use it. But they have absolutely nothing. You might have noticed in the burn shot that one guy had a broken off branch that he was doing something with. The second thing you notice is that all the people are involved. You know, when they came to talk to us about the small community forest they had, everybody was there. The women, the children, a couple of elderly people, and others. In general, in their context, they have very, very few resources. They have limited buildings, no electric power. The water, as you saw, is a very physical process to obtain water, and it's limited in its availability, particularly in the dry season, which is when this was. Government engagement is very low. Agency present is very low. Money is minimal. As well as that, there are some critical limitations that they face. So the level of education that they have access to. The village that we were visiting had a primary school with one teacher. They have limited access to systems. Without electricity, without communications infrastructure, they have very limited access to that. They don't have access to processes, sort of processes that most of us will use in the rest of the day to do some of the things that we do. They don't have. They don't have access to time. Throughout the seasons, there are always activities that have to be done sort of on time and in time, and that does take a lot of their daily time that they have available. One of the reasons for that is that for anywhere between 1 and 3 months of any year, people in these areas are food insecure. And then besides that, there's community politics and power structures. Every community you work in, some of you work in universities, I work in the FAO. I come from a small rural community in Australia, but I live in a large community in Sydney. There is community politics and there are power structures. Don't ever think that they don't exist, and don't ever stop looking for them. You might not change them, but they're there, and they're not only in developing countries. So what can we do? And this set of ideas is both for us living and working in developed countries and what we can do with different contexts and different situations, and also what can we do if we're working in or with developing country contexts. We can help each other. We can collate local data and other data. We can analyse that data. Some of the skills and capacities that you who are listening to this have are far and away beyond the capacities and opportunities of people in developing countries. They can learn what you know, and they can access that data in time when the systems are available and so on, but at the moment they can't. So if we can analyse that with them, then that would be really good. We can present the information without interpretation. That requires context, and unless you have spent a lot of time in Western Zimbabwe or Western Tanzania, you won't understand the context. I've worked in many countries. Probably the countries I've worked the most in would be Indonesia and Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and then Ghana and South Africa. And to be honest, I think I know very little of the context of any of those places. I know enough to know what it is I don't know. And I'd urge you to adopt that sort of frame. What we could do is begin the process. So we begin a discussion, whether it's within the Netherlands or it's here in Italy, where I am at the moment, whether it's in your geography, and then start exchanges. Now, exchanges are partly discussions, but they're also, you come to my house and have a look at what I eat and what I have in the refrigerator and how I cook it. And I go to your house and we do the same thing. Those sorts of things. I urge you to observe everything, to listen a lot, and to keep very, very, very quiet. It's a skill that we've lost a bit in the modern Western era of sitting and being quiet and just absorbing what's around us. But it's a skill that we need to relearn and to pick up on. We then need to share the interpretation as part of the process. It looks like this to me, it looks like that to you. And then frame options and develop conclusions, and do that incrementally. It's very difficult to go from little understanding and no context with some data partially analysed, have a discussion and then end up at an endpoint very quickly. I mentioned earlier that I was talking today to Indonesian companies. I was trying to talk to Indonesian companies between 1999 and 2003 with zero success. So it took time for them to understand what they needed to do and ask, and it took time for me to appreciate what their constraints and limitations were and what they were interested in. And then, having done these things, we need to continue to do them for a very long time. 20 years in the case of Indonesian large-scale plantation companies, but similarly for others. A random thought, all of you would have seen that there's a lot of interest and activity, some of it unfortunately negative and not contributing terribly well, but a lot around Black Lives Matter. And it's raised the concept of defunding the police force and redirecting the money. In fact, one of the cities in the US is committed to doing this. I read some research earlier in the week that suggested that 95% of arrests are for things that do not threaten public safety. So in other words, you don't need, the enforcement can be more general. So for fire management, just as a thought to take away, what about defunding fire suppression? 90% of fires burn less than 10% of the area burnt. The other 10%, of course, must take out, burn the rest of the 90%, and that's where most of our damage and loss is, of course. But if we were to divert some of that money to investment in diversity, equal access to data, to information, to discussions, to ideas, and to options for improvement, we could be shifting the funding to where it will most reduce the risk. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions or attempt to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Really great, informative presentation, and especially the beginning, just talking about the scope of fire, that sort of world context of it. I think it's great to give what we hear on the media, and then what is actually out there, and then some of the research challenges around it. We do have questions that came in, and I want to get to those. Excuse me, Pooja had asked, and this I think gets to a lot of the research challenges you were talking about. Do you think it is possible to perform spatial analysis of fire disturbance in a region with a small database? How do you wrestle with that, I suppose, when, from those, 83 countries that had no data? How do you even think about those? How do you get at it as a researcher?
It's a very critical question. Firstly, I'm not a researcher. I have done it, but it's a long time ago. I don't do it much anymore. I get people like you guys to do that and then help me to apply it. I think spatial analysis is critical because where fires happen gives you a starting point for asking a question about why in that place, why in that vegetation, why in that combination of circumstances. I'm not sure what's meant by a live database, but as an example, for instance, in Armenia, which is a very tiny country, it's a little more than 3 million hectares in size, they have some strong difficulties with fires, not because of their size, but because of the impact they have on the remaining forests that Armenia has. And so they're struggling to do a spatial analysis of their fire disturbance over history. And so sort of an open question, particularly to the remote sensing folk out there, is the small fires. MODIS doesn't detect small fires, and most fires that are used for agricultural purposes are small fires. As that example I showed, the whole fire was organised, started and finished within about 90 minutes. It was, as you saw, relatively small, and that they would have done the same thing the next day and the day before. So I think it's possible. I don't think there are very strong examples or sequences or processes to do them.
Very good. Simona had a question that just came in, and you were talking about this with that issue of effectively listening to communities, understanding them as you look at their challenges. She said, can you give some examples of the effect of community politics on fire prevention? I think in that way, both ways that have worked and maybe ways that the professor from the University of Dar es Salaam was finding angles to get in.
I was thinking of Christopher. Exactly. He's a very smart man, and he worked out he did a review of community-based fire management in Tanzania, and he did that by separating up the country into 9 areas, more or less consistent with language, the language that was spoken. Tanzania, of course, speaks Swahili as a national language, but most people speak at least their own local language and maybe another one. And so he divided the region up into that. And there's an example of things both ways. One is that there was one village where fire was very well managed. There were no problems, nobody in any of the demographic breakdowns, because Christopher was doing interviews with individual elderly people, men and women, with the whole group of the village, with the young people, with males, with the leadership group of the village, and then with females. And so what they found out was that in this particular village, the leadership group of the village were very happy to report that they didn't have any particular problems with fires, that they didn't suffer any issues. But they weren't really very clear on why that was the case until Christopher spoke to the women. And then it became very obvious why that was the case, because the women had it all under control. They were the ones who used fire to get rid of agricultural residues and to prepare land, because the men were doing other things, mostly working for wages and salaries out of the village. So there were a couple of reasons they didn't know. So if you like, the politics of that particular place was that the people in charge were benefiting from something that they had no idea was happening, in effect. On the other side of things, there was an example where a similar situation, in fact, the villagers were not aware of any significant or strong impacts, but the leadership group of the village, who are in most cases nearly always all men, had a very strong sort of, if you like, a command and control approach, where they were very careful about patrolling and checking for fires and things like that. Within that village, there was an issue, again, for the women in particular, because it meant that they had a lot of trouble being able to use fire the way they had traditionally understood it to be used. And particularly the elderly people in this village were reinforcing the fact that the fire had changed, and now they had lots of fires being put out, but they didn't have fires doing what they called useful things. Now, because of the work that Christopher did and the way he did it, I wasn't able to write those things up as stories. So I'll head off the next question by pointing out that I don't have a document that I can refer you to. I do have a report, and it's just reminded me to just check and see whether that can be circulated externally, because it was a Finnish-funded project.
Very good. Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to see that. Building on that, I wanted to ask this question next from Andy. He says, as you say, wildfires are in the spotlight briefly until something else steals the headlines. The wildfire community suffers from this, particularly at the political level. How do we ensure that wildfire remains on the agenda when it's raining?
It's a really good question. Some of you may have heard the name of Harry Luke, R.H. Luke, who wrote Bushfires in Australia. And I was lucky enough to interview Harry a number of times for my PhD, which was an oral history document, not a scientific document. Don't hold that against me, but and he would draw a graph, and he had a graph, two graphs that had exactly the same amplitude, but they were offset by about 6 months. And the graph on the left-hand side was the fire area burned and damage. So when it peaked, about 6 months later, you got a peak in funding, political interest and funding, and then that tapered off more or less at the same pace as the fire thing did because of that. So the first issue is that it's not easy to do that. How do we ensure wildfire remains on the agenda? I mentioned sectors, and I think one of the important things is that if you think about, say, let's look at Australia because I'm very familiar with it, but if you could say the same things, I suspect, about California, about Portugal, parts of Spain, certainly parts of southern Italy, the people that create the biggest part of the problem are the people who plan how land is to be used, the people who buy that land and then develop it and sell maybe houses or develop infrastructure on it, the people who then go and live in those places. And none of those groups, none of those sectors, the planners, the developers, the people who build things, the people who buy things and live in them, have any connection whatsoever to the fire management problem. So the fire management problem gets left with either the here in Italy these days, the carabinieri or the bomberos, and perhaps the land managers of the public. So we have to span that agenda. The World Bank recently released a report. It was the Pro4 part of the World Bank, which was, it's called a policy note. on wildfire management. And that has in it some efforts to try and describe in terms for the Minister for Economics, the Minister for International Development, the Minister for Finance and the Treasury, what the impacts of fires are and why they should be something that those sectors look to invest in. So I direct you towards that World Bank policy note as a starting point. It is high level because it's global, but nonetheless, it's got some suggestions in.
Yeah, I want to ask that we have time for about 2 more questions, and then
Sure.
we'll move to the second part of this. But Pooja has asked a question that actually reflects some other ones that have come in, and it builds on just what you were saying there about the challenges of governance almost. She asked, what kind of barriers do you think hinder an effective collaboration for different countries to work together for risk management?
I think at the straightforward level, one of the barriers is that we don't know each other enough. We don't have enough interaction. We don't, if I reflect on say the North American Forestry Commission of FAO, which has a fire management working group. Now that working group later this year, will have its 55th meeting. So that group's been meeting for has met 55 times. And part of the reason is that they get together annually and people get to know each other. So the Canadians get to know the Americans, and it's not just the Canadian Forest Service, it's one of the provinces on a rotational basis, and it's also CIFSI. In the US, it's also the Bureau of Land Management and all of those folks, so Department of Interior, US Forest Service, and so on, so the US Department of Agriculture. In Mexico, same thing. And then there's a couple of observers that come from FAO being one, but also New Zealand and Australia. Because they build that relationship over time, there's some very easy conversations that can happen around that. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be sufficient exchange to understand the context. If you travel to a new country, you probably don't understand almost anything about it. And so you need to have that frame of reference as a starting point and then learn as much as you can as you go. So I think that needs to happen. Other kinds of barriers, particularly where government agencies are involved. As a government officer, if you're working for a province or a national government, to get permission to travel to another country or even to another province sometimes is quite difficult. It can be quite difficult to get support to do that, even permission, let alone funding support to do that. So there's that sort of a barrier as well to do it. Another kind of barrier is that we're not really used to having cross-discipline, multi-sectoral engagements. The North American Forestry Commission Working Group, they're basically the fire management community. So one of the reasons they get on well is that they're, relatively speaking, similar people with similar backgrounds. We need to have more fora that have different people, different backgrounds, and different things. And that is more or less what will happen if you go to work in a developing country. So in Tanzania, for instance, where it's a country of 88 million hectares, they burn about 11 million hectares per year per annum. There is no responsible land management agency that has fire as a remit. The guy in the Tanzanian Forest Service who has the remit is also the head of communications. So when you get people together in that organisation and others, you get a whole lot of different folk coming in, wildlife, livestock, pastoral, even the fish folk turn up. So we need more opportunities like that, I think.
And just this final question, and it's a great segue into it from Jose. He's looking at the government's need to solve the land property issue. And he says, no matter how much skills, knowledge, ideas, know-how, et cetera, groups like this, groups like PyroLife can bring and others, if that issue isn't solved, we'll continue failing on any attempt of managing fires, especially in countries like the Amazon region or Indonesia. He wanted you to see what you thought of that. And, to your point about the needing to create those cross-boundary issues, I know both the working goal of PyroLife and its future goal is to do that very thing. So it's very nice to hear that on the webinar. But to Jose's point about the land property issue, if you can expound on that, I think it's a great point he brings up.
Yep, it is. It's a great point, and almost without exception, it either underpins the problem or it could underpin the solution. So it's either the problem is that the land is being allocated in ways that don't match either historical requirements and needs or local people, and therefore you end up with potentially conflict. It's very difficult to convince local people to invest anything long-term when they know the land they're working on, living on, making food from is not their own, or that they don't have real title to it. So that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is that if you do want to ensure some sort of consistency and sustainability around enduring solutions, then you need the tenure has to be worked out. You have to work out all of those things. I would have to say that in most developing countries I've worked in, it is probably the most difficult aspect of anything to work with, and it probably underpins many of the symptoms of problems we see in developing countries. So it's a critical thing, and it certainly needs to be talked on. I'd recommend to all of you to have who owns the land and what do they gain from it, who benefits and who loses, as a constant question in the back of your mind, wherever you are and whenever you're looking at fires.
Very good. Well, on that, thank you, Peter, for your presentation this morning and the questions you've answered. I think it's been very helpful to this, and really it'd be good for this webinar series to have this as a part of it.